At the moment, historical fiction is the closest we can get to time travel. A novel in this genre can transport us to ancient Egypt or to Imperial China. We can witness the founding of America or jump into the roaring 20s and celebrate Gatsby style. It can even take us to a more contemporary historical period, whether that's the 80s or 90s, or even some might argue the early 2000s. In some ways, historical fiction holds the same allure as fantasy, bringing us to a different time in our world, which can feel as alien and unfamiliar as a mystical land. Despite the fact historical fiction is grounded in reality, the glimpses it provides of the past can be just as marvelous and heartbreaking as what we read in the pages of a fantasy or science fiction novel. In addition to its ability to entertain, historical fiction has an educational component woven into its pages, giving educators many options to connect the story to historical reality. Let's learn a bit more about this genre and its characteristics. Historical fiction is our genre for this week. To start off with a definition, we can view it as a work that is set in a period earlier than the one in which it was written. So that's a pretty broad definition, right? So kind of by this argument, even something as recently as the early 2000s, the 90s, might be considered historical fiction. And in some cases you could argue it would be, right? Because it's happened in the past, it's not the present. Another definition that might give us a bit more specificity emphasizes the fact that the period of the setting is the defining and integral feature of the work. And usually a historical fiction book or story is going to attempt to convey the events, manners, customs, and psychologies of the past seriously and with care. So, there's often a difference between like a period piece and historical fiction. Sometimes that line is kind of fine, but historical fiction might be focused on a specific event or time period, and again, that part of the work's quality and focus is on presenting an accurate picture. Many works are set in the past, but they would not necessarily be considered historical fiction because, again, there's not that intensity and focus on accuracy. So like we were just saying, setting a novel in the past does not necessarily make it historical fiction. And so usually historical fiction novels and stories are going to be set much earlier than the period in which it is written. It's usually going to feature historical figures, either as main characters, side characters, or sometimes just as cameo appearances. It's going to have concrete historical details based on research and reality. And often, but not always, it will take place during well-known historical events or periods. And historical fiction, in addition to just being, an entertaining and interesting genre, can also be a way for us to kind of rework and reconceptualize traumatic moments in our culture. In the time of slavery in the United States, war, genocide, natural disasters, man-made disasters, things like the Titanic, World War II, the Holocaust. These can all be prime candidates for historical fiction, and we often see a lot of works, especially around World War II, because again, it might be a way to us to keep returning to these ideas and to these events and trying to make sense of these, pretty traumatic, terrible things that happened in our history. And a historical fiction can be one way to kind of re-examine those and again, try to find some meaning in them. For children, especially with historical fiction, it can be a way to reckon with some of the uglier parts of the past, or even just historical events. One of the things that can be both good and bad is that historical fiction may also give a sense of nostalgia for those time periods. Again, it might kind of portray the past as being better or more golden or more desirable than the present, which can sometimes oversimplify and sanitize the past. There's kind of often the sense of the 1960s being this idyllic era where, the family was important and kind of everyone was moving into the suburbs and was living much more comfortably and cozily. The 1960s is also the civil rights period, right? We see horrific violence and prejudice and racism rearing their ugly heads against African Americans. So again, we might view those times as more golden, but are they actually? On the plus side though, the role of historical fiction also personalizes history, which gives us usually a more relatable way to access these historical facts, and it also makes it more emotional. And again, when we connect with something emotionally, we usually care about it more. Personally, history was never my favorite subject. I always found it a bit dry. I always preferred reading historical fiction because it gave it to me in a narrative format and gave me characters that I could relate to and learn about and kind of become empathetic with. Whereas a history textbook just didn't do that for me. Another interesting angle of historical fiction is that it can sometimes give us a different perspective. Historical fiction can often focus on events that are important to the founding of a nation. So especially in American historical fiction, we might see a lot of focus on the Revolutionary War, on the Civil War, on slavery, on these events that really played a role in forming our country into the nation it is today. So in some cases, there's criticism of historical fiction for inspiring nationalism, maybe kind of again ignoring some of the uglier parts of a country's history in favor of celebrating the exceptional. At the same time, though, historical fiction does something that history textbooks have long not done, providing an opportunity to present an outsider or non-traditional perspective of history. So we think about books especially that feature women and kind of their experiences during the Civil War or the Revolutionary War. That's not a perspective we always get. When we have stories set during slavery that feature the perspectives of enslaved peoples, and we kind of get their version of the story, again, it makes a more human version of history. We might be able to see a disabled person's perspective of history, or someone who is part of the LGBTQ community, maybe telling kind of what it was like to live in a certain period. So it does give us an option and an opportunity to flip the narrative sometimes, to look at history from a different lens, and that often usually enriches our understanding of that history. When we think about, who's writing history textbooks and how we understand history, it does require interpretation. We take archaeological findings and findings of documents and, knowledge of events, oral retellings, and we then have to make sense of that history from those. So it does involve a degree of analysis and interpretation, and right, interpretations can be biased. So when we think about historical fiction, it again offers us another way to overcome some of these biases or see a different view of history. Some of the things we want to keep in mind though with historical fiction, and sometimes some of the critiques, is how much creative liberty should historical fiction authors have. A historical fiction book is obviously not fact. It's based in fact and reality, but it's going to often have many fictional elements to it, whether it's created characters, created scenarios. So how much creative liberty and wiggle room should an author have before we consider it just straight up fiction? And so kind of related to that come the problems of accuracy, authenticity/plausibility, and presentism. So with accuracy, we want to think, how faithful is the work to the historical record? So again, these can kind of be good starting off points for an assignment, to have students actually do some research and kind of make an opinion and establish an argument about how well a historical fiction book or story portrays the area it's seeking to portray. We also want to think, are the events portrayed likely or realistic for that time period? So I love a good story set in the past where a woman acts very independently and very modern, but again, how authentic or plausible is that for the roles that women had actually in those time periods, especially much earlier in our history? It can be great to read, but again, is it really kind of actually authentic to that time? And connected to that is this idea of presentism. Is the work giving us an ideology or belief that's more characteristic of the present than the past? Again, is it giving us kind of that too much of that contemporary perspective through the characters or through the point that the author's trying to make? On top of all that though, right, historical fiction does have a great educational application, like we talked about at the intro to this video. More so than other genres, they're really viewed, historical fiction books, for their educational value, because again, they've got that real world connection. Many times they'll feature endnotes, afterwords, epilogues, sometimes even prologues or beginning notes from the author that offer some context for the historical occurrences of the novel. They might kind of explain the historical event. They might explain their research process. They may include a list of sources, or in their acknowledgement section they may refer to experts that they consulted. So again, they really have to kind of prove in a historical fiction book. We often see the author making the case for the reality of that story, and kind of the real world research that went into that portrayal of the past. It also offers an excellent opportunity for intertextuality. Students can look at nonfiction documents, historical accounts, other historical fiction written about the same event or time period. So again, there's kind of the option to mix fiction and fiction to see how two different authors, maybe potentially from different points of view, are portraying that period. And there's also, again, that opportunity to actually look at real-world primary documents. So maybe you're looking at the Revolutionary War portrayal of a person who was a slave of a soldier, and maybe then also looking at some historical documents of the things the Founding Fathers were writing about equality and freedom, and kind of how that clash and that disconnect is happening. Historical fiction stories and books often win children's awards. They have a high representation in literary awards because, again, it is a genre that has that real-world application and also just seems to be so compelling to us.